Welcome to the Martin Roth Symposium 2020. This symposium aims to bring together thought leaders from the cultural, the academic, the artistic and political sectors to share ideas and scenarios. Presented by IFA, the Institute für Auslandsbeziehungen, in cooperation with Republika, this second Martin Roth Symposium takes place as a digital theme week from 7th to 11th September 2020 and also kindly supported by the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin and funded by Germany's Federal Foreign Office. Let's dive together into today and talk about museums and power. Museums have been transformed from exclusive places like royal collections in previous centuries to spaces open to the public. But how inclusive are today's museums on closer inspection? What is the role of museums as a democratizing and inclusive space for critical dialogue about the past and the future? Is it correct to talk about museums as public powerhouses for society? And what active roles can museums play in modern societies? And what are the limits? In fact, how political should museums be? How independent can museums as a research institution be, shaped under the influence of governments and ideological positions? As you can see, there are lots of questions on our plate today. Today we'll try to find answers concerning the roles of public and private museums in society. And of course, what's needed to be considered when managing a museum in the 21st century? I'd like to give you an overview on how we walk together through the day on museums and power. Speakers will present their thoughts on the topic and the questions I've just mentioned in sprint sessions, which are 10 minutes inputs. We have Julia Grosse and Yvette Mutumba with us today. They breathe new life into the world of contemporary art. Based in Berlin, they design exhibitions and founded the magazine Contemporary End. Roxana Omar, the CEO of ICOM Museum South Africa, will be with us. And also, General Director of the Humboldt Forum, Hartmut Dorgalo. Also, Gus Casely-Hayford, Director of Vienna East. And Elvira Espejo, poet, essayist and Director of the National Museum of Ethnography and Folklore in La Paz, Bolivia. Following each speaker, we will have a deep dive. And this is not about speed. It's about a deep exchange between you, the audience, and the speakers. And as we are all in the virtual space, it'll be a 15-minute live online exchange in a digital discussion room. Here, you can meet many of our speakers for Q&As after their sessions. And in case you need further information, just click on the button Dabei sein, take part, on the website campus.republika.com. Before opening for questions or comments by you, some first responders present their thoughts on the sprint. It's a kick-off for the following lively discussion. And today's first responders are Benita von Malzahn, Director Global Cultural Engagement of Volkswagen Group, and Nico Daswani, Head of Arts and Culture at the World Economic Forum. And we close the day with our Future Forward session, a conversation between a forward-thinking professional and a student responder to provide a look into today's topic from their perspectives. So I would say, let's get started. Are you ready? Let's have some powerful sprints together.
Hello, everyone. This is Julia and this is Yvette. We are the founders of Contemporary End and Contemporary and America Latina, two art magazines focusing on contemporary art from Africa and its global diaspora. We are co-published by the IFA and also the Goethe Institute, and Contemporary End was founded in 2013. And we are really interested in this whole symposium and also in this topic, MuseumFutures, where we will give some thoughts in a minute, because we work a lot with different museums. We feature reviews on our platform. We discuss a lot with artists from all over the world around the roles of institutions. But here in the framework of our input, we are mainly focusing on what role or what the futures are of museums, particularly in Europe and in the US. And so now I give over to my colleague, Julia.
So thanks again as well from me for the invitation to speak to you today and discuss with you later on. Yeah, as Yvette said, from our perspective and from many perspectives, obviously, the museums, especially in Europe and North America, find themselves in a very very unique, very challenging situation, have to ask themselves many profound and fundamental questions on many levels. Really, it's a big task, and it starts with the question: how accessible are we as a museum? How diverse are we as a museum? And diversity in terms of how how many migrational backgrounds and perspectives do we have within our structure, but as well in terms of guests and visitors, but as well diversity in terms of class is really unseparable. You can't separate it from questions around migrational backgrounds, etc. So museums have to ask themselves, where does diversity or diverse infrastructure start and or end, not only, for example, with the security staff at the museum, but as well how diverse is our curatorial team, how diverse is our board, how diverse is our association of friends at the museum, etc. Another question many museums, or almost all of them, have to ask themselves right now is how did the pandemic influence and really change the whole way museums have to organize their programs? Is the blockbuster maybe dead? Is the time for huge exhibitions drawing in a lot of people as well from many perspectives? Is this kind of exhibition under threat because we can't realize these kind of big events anymore, etc.? So it's a very, very long list, and we could go on, but we don't have the time right now in this sprint. But these are questions we are thinking about a lot, because, as Yvette said, we're very much in closing discussions with people from the institutions, but as well with students, etc. So, and we haven't even included the ethnological and history museums who have other challenges as well and questions to ask themselves. So this is what we're very interested in to discuss with you.
Yeah, and this may be picking up on those different challenges. I would like to also bring out one focus maybe, which is the question that museums had to face now in the moment where the eruption of Black Lives Matter had a deep effect on the cultural scene, on the art scene, especially in Europe. Not especially, but it was interesting to see that also European institutions sort of picked up on that, started to post solidarity declarations on social media and so on. And while we think that it is, of course, important that finally institutions felt like that they had to sort of take a position towards that, we also feel very much that it is very overdue, and that this way how the solidarity was expressed also raises a lot of questions, because it shows how much it seems that it hasn't been a topic before, that now suddenly many institutions rushed towards this, and we're trying to kind of make up for the lack of maybe interest or knowledge, or kind of an ignorance towards how their own structures work. So I think this is something that really needs to be taken into question, and I think it's also important to point out that, because in our experience, also in our own interactions with museums most recently, because we also do offline projects where we work with museums, this moment right now has been handled like it is this current trend, or like this acute situation, which often feels like that there isn't really the sensibility for the fact that this is just an eruption of something that has been there for decades, if not centuries. So there is a lot of that still needs to be acknowledged and needs to be listened to. And we think this is really, if you talk about the futures of the museum, it has to be also really about that, how to look into their own structures and what that means. Especially, I think also European museums, many of them would probably say they don't have structural racism in the institutions. And I think this is also one reason why that's being said, or maybe often also being perceived like that, is that the definition of what racism can be is very different from various perspectives. And so for us, for example, racism is also the fact that there are so many collections and institutions that have ignored everything beyond Europe and North America for a really long time, and only starting now to kind of open up to look into what's being produced out there, like maybe in the past 3 or 4 years. So there are a lot of questions, I think, that also those people that are working inside the institutions have to face, even though it might be very uncomfortable. And I really am a strong believer in the fact that discomfort can only lead to change if it is like really complicated, if you have to face things, which includes also that you have to that you have to share power. And it goes into the direction what Julia said about diversity, that it has to, you know, means you have to maybe step back sometimes to make space to listen and to invite people also into the structures to work there, not on a one-off project or on a one-off symposium or a one-off performance, but in a really sustainable way. That means to build new positions where people can actually really start doing something on a long-term basis.
Because if you, for example, look at many of the museum's mission statements, what they stand for, what they're interested in, many museums claim or say that they are there to represent and to speak to all parts of society, and which is obviously a fantastic idea and approach as a museum. But what does this really mean if you look into, you know, the practical turnout, how you're going to really draw in a wider sense or really a diversity of society? And obviously there are many ways, but obviously as well it's very tricky to really you know, curate a program or have, as Yvette said, mentioned already, have a collection that really speaks to all visitors, you know, really all visitors, and has artworks from artistic producers, from you know, different migrant perspectives, etc. Or how open or how diverse is, for example, your exhibition program. Many people, you know, many museums don't, let's say, dare to open up in terms of letting in mainstream topics, because mainstream is the bad word in a way. Yeah, mainstream is not culture. So why don't, for example, museums show you know, a more diverse program in terms of having a show on the Vikings, followed by a retrospective on Kerry James Marshall, maybe followed by a group show bringing together young digital artists, for example. Yeah, it's a very diverse program and brings in very diverse people, but we have, you know, they have to deal with each other because there's society. And if the museums want to start, you know, really representing a whole, you know, range of voices who, you know, want to feel represented in that house, they have to start, you know, doing a program reflecting this diversity.
Okay, so this maybe just to wrap it up, really also relates to how maybe curatorial practices need to be thought in a way, how accessible museums can be, which is also relevant in terms of language and in terms of how concepts are being mediated and in terms of how budgets also are distributed. So there are a lot of questions there, and I mean, we will have more time to discuss this when we move over to the deep dive sessions. So we hope to see lots of you there and have to, you know, continue with like really interesting conversations and discussions, and then later also wrap it up. And yeah, so see you later.
Take it from there.
Bye.
Bye.
Anyone remotely interested in the politics of civilization will be aware that museums are repositories of those things from which Western civilization derives its wealth of knowledge, allowing it to rule the world, and likewise when the true collector on whose effort the museum depends gathers together his first objects, he almost never asks himself what will be the ultimate fate of his hoard when their pieces pass through their hands. The first true collector who would later exhibit, categorize, and catalogue their great collections in the first catalogues, which were the encyclopedias, initially never recognized these objects, what they were. From the Museum of Innocence by Orhan Pamuk. Robert Janes says, museums are the chronicles of our adaptive failures and successes, not to mention the chronicles of our creativity and pathos. In this sense, museums are akin to biological seed banks that were seeds as a source of planting in case seed reserves elsewhere as are destroyed. Both these authors, Albert Pamuk in writing fiction, are alluding to the importance and burden of museum management and practice, that they are reminding museum managers that we are not located in a static world where wonder and charm are our missions, but that we are surrounded by a dynamic world which is fueled by controversy and debate. Yet both these authors are also recognizing the value of and fragility of what we do as museums. And at the heart of their quotes, museum management is being reminded of their political responsibilities. Who decide what seed to store and what seed to keep? And who say that an object is just an object without any meaning? And who decides to collect an object at the expense of other objects? It is within this context that I want to support the view that museums are complex enterprises that have had to survive, thrive, and reinvent themselves. Our museums have acted as imperial agents, displaying their trophies. They've helped construct national identities. They have helped share new meanings to our understanding of the world. But what we have never come to grips with is how we unleash our shackles and create a new post-colonial museum that is waiting to erupt and surprise the world. My question is, will this ideal museum ever emerge? Is the internal politics and internal driven agendas of curatorial practice that dominates our work be our stranglehold? Or is it our inertia that is going to contribute to our demise? Because we have seldom looked at our own storerooms to see what it holds, what it is holding, and what is holding us down. The closed vision, blinkered museum, which conforms and consorts with the political elite, have a fine balancing act to play, because they say, today you are in, tomorrow you are out. In my frame of reference, the receptive, intuitive, and thinking museum is one that recognizes the multiplicity of its mandates and approaches. Each of its mandates is in a very different but considered manner. Museums are not in a one-size-fits-all business. And engaging with the complexity of our practice will ensure that museums are prepared to deal with local, national, and global discourses today more than ever before in the COVID-19 pandemic midst and post post-COVID-19 era, museums have to show that they are open to change, nimble, agile, and accepting that it is not business as usual. We have to create the space and demand for our offerings, and our approaches have to be responsive to those changes. I argue that there are two types of museums that have existed in the 20th century and early 21st century, representing different worldviews of place, space, creative engagement with its multiple audiences. One is an anachronistic archetype whose historical role has been surpassed, whose institutional remnants are still in existence and can be seen in various places. I want to argue that that kind of museology that implies is not difficult to undertake by comparison to the newer models, but whose relevance is limited. The new models, although build and extend the idea of a museum as cultural institution and historical repositories of knowledge, are more experimental and have to confront many challenges, especially the desire to transform and become more relevant to audience participation and respond to pressures of democratization and globalization. This latter type defies easy description to pressures of categorization, as I shall explain. This engagement over what should a relevant museum be, who should it address itself to, and what context is based on my experience over the last 3 decades working in museums. The modern museum was treated as a kind of sacred place, closed off to the ebb and flow of everyday life. It reflected, or rather inculcated, the idea of being part of a place of high culture, a celebration of extraordinary and outstanding. And in a colonial setting represented the triumph and trophies of conquest. This type of museum is unsustainable. Although this new museum is not fully developed, or our theory of this new museum is not fully developed, the contours that I have described are very evident. It implies new kinds of relations, such as partnerships with community and non-governmental organizations, and with other cultural institutions, academics, social welfare partners, and multiple partners. It demands new research initiatives and incorporates universities and technical institutions. These new relationships have to be open, democratic, and focused. The new museums are reflective, I believe, can strongly tap into these trends and be creative in engaging with its multiple audiences and transforming by its very activities the definition of the post-colonial, post-liberation museum. Our mandate has to focus on changing power relations with our publics and engage with the marginalized, powerless, and incorporate their world view into how we address issues of decoloniality, revive human dignity, and make equality our emphasis. Thank you. I look forward to engaging with you further and taking your questions.
So welcome, dear participants. It's beautiful to have you with us for the second day of the Martin Roth Symposium, especially for this deep dive with Julia Grosse, Editor-in-Chief of Contemporary and Contemporary and America Latina, whose sprint you just saw. And I also like to welcome Nico Daswani, Head of Arts and Culture at World Economic Forum, who will be our first responder. My name is Fabian. I will guide you through the deep dives today. And we are very happy that Julia and Nico are with us. And we'll take time to answer your questions. So just a short note for our audience on how to participate in this deep dive session. If you have a question, there are 3 ways to include them in this discussion. The first one is via direct audio in this webinar. Please click on the raise your hand icon, which you can find in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. As soon as it is your turn, I will call you by name and enable your audio. Please unmute yourself so you can ask your question. As soon as you have asked it, we will turn off your audio again and your video will never be used. If you prefer, you can also ask the question in writing in the chat of this webinar, or you use our online forum at campus.re-publica.com, campus.re-publica.com, if you are following it from a website or via YouTube, and we will include those questions as well. And as we have little time, I would like to ask Nico for his quick reaction on Yvette's and Julia's sprint.
Thank you so much. And hi, Julia. Thank you so much for your talk just earlier with Yvette. You both made so many excellent points across such a wide range of and spectrum of issues. You know, from the validity of the blockbuster shows to museums waking up to racial inequality in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement to as you discussed the sort of systemic structural exclusion that means that it's still by and large a non-representative group of people who decide what culture is and how it should be produced and how it should be consumed. So I try to channel my inner Martin Roth when I try to formulate a response here, wondering, as I often do, in this case, not just what Martin would say in these times, but also what he might do. Of course, you know, as you know, Martin was a straight talker and a fast doer. And I think Martin may have said that really we have to get hip to the fact that there's really no inherent incentive for those in power to share their power. And this is demonstrated throughout the course of human history, and we've been having these conversations about opening up the museum for decades now, and we've seen change, but it's change that is safe for those in power, because while it inches towards systemic inclusion, it does not do so at the peril of rocking the establishment. But now I feel perhaps there's an opportunity for radical change. So I've been looking at what some private funders have been doing, mainly private foundations. And it's been interesting to see in the past few years, as you may know, the Ford Foundation, for example, now funds all of its programs through the lens of social justice. So if the project does not contribute to social justice in some way, it does not get funded. So social justice really is like the main frame there. And in the wake of the pandemic, there's been this incredible leadership from private funders and public funders for the emergency funding to keep artists and small and large institutions afloat. Of course, including Andres Gorgon and the German Foreign Office, who sponsored this gathering here. And what's been interesting is some have taken this as an opportunity to fix perennial issues. So I was just reading today, actually, the Mellon Foundation in the United States has now reorganized all its programs and will assess each grant candidate by looking at how their work will contribute to a more just and fair society. And so if a proposal cannot demonstrate that, they don't get money. And so I've been thinking that in the same way that large government bailouts to financial firms and big business come with conditions, they always come with conditions, and some will say not enough conditions, but they come with conditions, for example, for better fiscal responsibility. I think this is a time for us, especially with public money, to look at the cultural institutions when they are getting these emergency subsidies now in this kind of reset and ask simple questions. Moving forward, why do we fund you? As a publicly funded institution, how are you contributing to a more just and fair society? How do you demonstrate that? So all of a sudden, we've got this different set of performance indicators, and one may agree or disagree with how much an institution actually is contributing or not to society, But that now becomes the frame for the main conversation of the value of a museum or a cultural institution, a frame that is, more in tune with the times, with the expectation of the public. And I believe that it's when we change the dominant framework of what is considered the norm, essentially, that we can start to create a slightly faster change. I would hope so, because now those who are in power have to demonstrate how their work will contribute to a more just and fair society, and will have to surround themselves with a broader diversity of people and be opening, they'll be opening new committees and be open to doing things in a new way, or else they just don't get funded. And so now they have to be relevant to society in order to survive. And I think that, again, rather than just talking about it, Martin may perhaps have, and I'm reaching here, but I can imagine him trying to create a coalition of governments and foundation officials that aligned along new shared, for lack of a better term, KPIs, key performance indicators, that change what you have to demonstrate in order to get money. Because if we go back to COVID, or if we go back to the world after COVID, essentially with the same power dynamics, this will have been a sort of a tragically missed opportunity to change some of these systemic issues. So thanks again, Julia, and of course, Yvette, for your wonderful contribution. Certainly for me, it was very enlightening to hear you speak and raised a lot of these thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me try to answer your many, or react to your many points, which were super interesting. Maybe first of all, what would have Martin Roth had said? Yeah, it's a good question, because in a way, just naively looking at his program, for example, what he did at the V&A in the UK, in London, is, I have to say, compared to Germany, so much far ahead, of what, in terms of a program, a museums program, of what we can see, in many German museums, by creating this very, very diverse rhythm of exhibitions. Having the David Bowie exhibition, or Alexander McQueen, but at the same time the Vikings. He had this kind of mixture. We would obviously love to go even a step further and say, okay, it's important to, if we talk about, as a museum, for example, including or speaking to the whole of society, you really have to go in a way, especially, in Europe, you have to go the whole, all the way, and have to have a look at who is part of our society, and who do we want to draw in to the museum. Yesterday, one deep dive was talking about the fact that, of course, it means huge research to, first of all, see who is the society we want to draw in. And this is, for example, something which I think museums should start doing, or maybe, as you say, increase the pressure on museums, what they have to do and what they need to come up with. Really do research, and really deep research on what, who is society, and how, if we have the results, how can we really start and reflect in our program what this society wants. And that's why we always come back to ideas of the blockbuster in terms such as mainstream, because obviously, the bigger the topic, the more people you draw into an exhibition. And this, goes always to the next question of quality. Okay, how low do you have to go then? Once you have this, a big, let's name it blockbuster, or big inclusive show which speaks to many people. Yeah. And I think this is something Martin Roth really was ahead of in Germany anyway, but really, really good at doing this kind of, as I said, rhythm of different formats within, his within the exhibition format. And I think that was quite unique. If I would, and I think this idea of increasing pressure on museums is fantastic. I think it's important as well. You mentioned the Ford Foundation and Mellon Foundation. We ourselves, are part of the freedom of speech program at Ford, for example, and they, as you say, look very closely at what you do and if you really fall into these categories, and that's why we're really happy to be part of this program. But ideally, because this is kind of imposed, or this is something the museums have to do, but ideally, a museum director or a museum itself would realize that it's about time, so that you don't have to, increase the pressure and impose something on them, like programs, etc. But ideally, all museums would, at this moment, I think should feel that they have to do this.
Yeah, could I jump in with a question? Because
yes,
what I really liked about your talk was that Yvette said that museums see it as a trend at the moment, and I wondered how we could change that perception to make it long-lasting and to make it sustainable, this whole change, because I feel there is something changing, and you can see that in institutions as well. How can we make it long-lasting?
Yeah, it's a big question, obviously, but one way, for example, looking at the exhibition programs, which obviously try to open up more, to be more diverse, to get in more global topics, or exhibitions focusing on global perspectives, etc. The routine nowadays is always to get in an expert for a season or for one exhibition. You pay them, they do their job, and then off they go. And this is obviously something which doesn't mean change within the institution, because, let's say, the curatorial staff or infrastructure stays the same, and stays the same very inclusive group of people, of experts who always get in the help from, let's say, global experts who come from abroad, but just stay for the period of 3 months and then go again. So this is something which obviously needs to change in terms of what you was just mentioning, what Yvette said, to have a more sustainable program which includes many voices and positions within the institution, and not only getting the experts in if you need them and send them home again if you don't need them anymore.
So it's also important for the institutions to change, and also for people to step down actually from their job and from their position. And I would like to know from Nico how the World Economic Forum actually does that change and how it is evolving, and if there are already implications to change the whole procedure.
Yeah, look, it's a fascinating time, a tragic time, and a fascinating time, and an important time for us to just, in a way, adopt a beginner's mindset. A lot of the institutions, cultural institutions, even the World Economic Forum, have been successful for 40, 50, 60 years doing what they do. And this pandemic kind of upends a lot of the things that we thought we knew, and a lot of the expertise that we've developed. And so in a way, we have to become more generalists than specialists. And if you're a generalist, I think you have to be a little bit more humble about what it is that you can actually do and what it is that you cannot do, and who you then need to reach out to be able to build. And I think that the more enlightened leaders are able to see that you inherently need to be more inclusive, not just diverse, but inclusive in how you move forward, because the world is just so complex, the butterfly effect of how one thing connects to another. I mean, just look at the pandemic, right? Something happens in a market in Wuhan, and then look at the world now. So our sort of linear approach to expertise and how our fields develop have to be completely opened up. Otherwise, institutions, cultural institutions, international organizations are not relevant anymore.
But I think inclusive is tricky as well, because before the inclusion, there was an exclusion. You know what I mean? Because who's including now? If the museums, suddenly realize, oh, we have to include more, this again comes from, a certain position of power who can say we include now. This why I find inclusion always very tricky as well.
Unless there is pressure from the public, from people, and we see this in the social movements, and we've seen the backlash of museums that took a long time and cultural institutions that took a long time to respond to the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, that was a very clear example of the public saying, what is your response? And employees of these places, but also I think the funding, follow the money, I have to say, it becomes key, because when diversity and inclusion is a sort of a one aspect but not part of the core, then it is always something that can be used as a soft power tool, or as a way to show that you are reaching out to the community. But again, those in power don't have any inherent incentive really to open up the power. So it needs to be we need to be in this time. And you said, for example, you said, Julia, or maybe it was Yvette, but one of you talked about the boards and the decision makers, and so some of I know that Ford Foundation and others look at the composition of the boards of the institution.
I have to jump in here very quickly, sorry, because we already are over time. I know it's a shame. It's really a shame. I'm glad that you're going to be with us for the last discussion on Friday, Julia, again, to hear more about your opinion. I'm glad that Nico will be with us for the next deep dive as well, who will be with Roxana Omar, whose sprint you already heard. Thank you again for taking the time, Julia, and see you on Friday. And we will have a short break, and then the next deep dive starts. So welcome back, dear participants who were in the first deep dive, and welcome to all new participants for joining us in this session right now. We are very happy to have you with us, and we are very happy to have Roxana Omar, CEO of ICOM Museums of South Africa, with us now as well, whose sprint you already saw, and Nico Daswani, Head of Arts and Culture at World Economic Forum, is still with us. As said before, you have three ways of including yourself or how to participate in this discussion. You can participate via direct audio in this webinar by clicking the raise your hand icon. You can ask your question in the chat of this webinar, or you use our online form at campus.re-publica.com if you're following from our website or YouTube. So let's dive in. I would pass the word over to Nico again, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Fabian. Hi, Roxana. Lovely to meet you.
Yes, lovely to meet you too.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was fascinating, and you asked strong questions. How can we unleash our shackles and create the post-colonial museum? And then you asked, will this museum ever emerge? And it got me thinking a little bit about the shackles of the actual physical buildings. You talked about the new type of relevant museum, which develops partnerships with NGOs and social welfare organizations and academics and universities. And so perhaps we can push the idea of outreach all the way out, in that not being bound by an edifice or not only being bound by an edifice could be a way to change and somewhat liberate a little bit the inherent power dynamics that are imbued in the museum space. What does a museum do when it's not in a building? Is it still a museum? Does it still provide value as an institution? And I ask this because many of the buildings of major institutions and cultural institutions are strong physical architectural manifestations of what you talked about, what you discussed. There's certain kind of elite aspiration, this sometimes national identity, these temples of knowledge. And many of them, of course, are magnificent, and we love to visit them. But one question could be: is that building, however beautiful it might be, in tune with its local surroundings? Today, it was back then at a time. Is it today? Is it in tune with the local community? Does it feel like a spaceship, out of context, or does it feel like there's a sort of a symbiotic relationship between the building, the programming, and the interaction that happens within it, and the community that it is embedded in? And sorry, Roxana, you wanted to come in?
No, go ahead.
I was thinking on a related note that I was the great stage designer Es Devlin in a conversation a couple of months back. She remarked that some of these glorious buildings occupy actually prime real estate in cities, but they're often open only 3 hours a day, in the case of a concert hall or a theater, for example. So what else could take place in these major buildings during the day? I mean, of course, they're rehearsals, but, how can those spaces turn the times when, they're dark, into moments where they can be perhaps more part of the community, to not feel as alien to those who maybe walk in front of that building every day and perhaps don't feel like they belong. And then a third thing on your point of museums transitioning from that older type, I think you said representing a time of conquest, as you said, to being more engaged with the current times. I wanted to highlight the Natural History Museum in London, which recently launched a new strategy for the museum, and they talk about themselves. This is fascinating. They talk about themselves as an institution that creates the next generation of climate activists. And I find that just absolutely visionary. And it doesn't negate the extraordinary collections, and indeed the incredible building in which they're housed. But instead, what it does is it adds a new dimension. It adds a dimension of being consciously an agent of change. And so perhaps it's when these museums have as part of their identity, or their redefined identity in this new time, as you talked about it, that great sense of responsibility to being agents of change, of positive change, that the power dynamics maybe begin to change because their inherent role and their relationship to the building begin to change. So those were just a few thoughts, Roxana, on the fascinating talk that you gave, and which comes from, as you said, so much, 3 decades of experience of the ins and outs of museum practice.
Yes, Nico, I just want to start off by saying that, of course, my frame of reference is very much a part of the South. I'm in Africa. I'm in South Africa, and I work in a museum, or serve in a museum, that will soon be 200 years old in 2025. And so the shackles you are talking about, and that I talk about in the paper, relate very directly to those collections, and how those collections represent a kind of suppression, represent domination, represent suppression, and it leaves out a very important narrative, and that is of the people that were subjugated. And being conscious of that makes us very aware of the fact that the buildings that we are in are regarded as magnificent edifices, but that they also scare people. They make people feel unwelcome, particularly those that have been repressed. And with the Black Lives Matter, people feel that they're going into a government building that doesn't relate to their lives. So what we have done, and what I see as something that's very important, and I think there was a man a librarian called John Cotton-Dana, where he wanted museums to, in fact, not just be located in a central point where people could come and visit, where everybody could have access, not just the elite. And he wrote this in, I think, 1917, he wrote the work, The Gloom of the Museum. And he talks about having different museums all over, located in different communities. And that's what I like about our museums in the South, in that we try to have community outreach. It doesn't have to have a collection. It is about recollection. It is connecting with communities who talk about their lives, their experiences, and what matters to them. And the fact that they may not have those huge objects to represent their lives, doesn't mean that their lives and what their connection to the world doesn't matter. So we have a situation where we have a museum on wheels, where we take the museum on a bus to communities in far-flung, remote areas, and let ordinary people who can't afford to put bread on the table visit our museum on wheels and have an experience. But whenever we can, we make it possible for communities to come to our museums through various partnerships with bus companies, etc., the railway system. So that's pretty important. And I think that we are on the cusp of a huge change with COVID. The blockbusters are going to be challenged because with COVID, I don't know when next we're going to have people coming in their droves through all the various, you know.
If I can jump in with a question real quickly, because you already, as you used the term of being a post-colonial museum as well, I had the question, or the question was coming in, whether you think that the term post-colonial is actually Eurocentric, as it is often seen as depriving former colonies from their history. And if so, if you have a suggestion on which term to use, actually.
Well, that's a very difficult one. I think now we're entering into the whole issue of decoloniality. And again, perhaps a post-colonial is, you know, but there has to be some marking and some attempt to move away from the colonial museum. So maybe it shouldn't be the colonial museum. Maybe it should be the community museum, but maybe it shouldn't be the, you know, I think we're grappling with all these terminologies and that there's no one defining term for this museum that we're going to see, this ideal museum that is going to be able to have multiple personalities and talk to multiple people and be engaging to everybody within our societies that we serve. But we have to consciously work at breaking down the shackles that actually hold us, you know, as museums, and really think, again, I don't like this word, but think out of the box. And maybe, you know, I don't know whether we call it a museum anymore, whether it's, I don't know, a marketplace of ideas, as one would say, you know, does a museum have to have a collection? In some parts of Africa, it's just where people come to a tree and share ideas and share their experiences.
You would describe museum rather as community spaces, if I may describe it that way.
I would also like to see it as inclusive spaces, inclusive community spaces. But obviously we have collections and we have stories and we have, you know, multiple voices that we speak to and we have to listen to break down those boundaries that we have created, you know, over the years, over the centuries, actually.
I would like to know your opinion on that as well, Nico, as you, like, how can we help to create those spaces? And how can the state also help, or state institutions, or maybe also not state institutions, but maybe public or private foundations help to establish those places and safe spaces for communities?
Yeah, I think it goes to the principles of institutions being responsive and listening to people. Often, you know, is the programming and the exhibitions, are those informed only by market pressures, which, you know, might be okay. You know, we have to make ends meet and museums have to pay the bills, and or are they informed by a kind of a sense of collective consciousness? And how is that collective consciousness informed? Is it informed by listening, by socialization? Roxana talks about a museum on wheels and going to places where people never have this kind of access. And I think that's it's a different way of thinking about outreach, where, you know, it's not outreach, it becomes core to the identity of the institution, that those who engage in their diversity create the identity of the museum, rather than the museum having an identity and trying to impose it or to sell it to a group of people that don't feel like they belong.
And I would like to ask one last question before we finish this up. We tend to talk about how politics influence museums, but I would also like to put the question on, if we put the museum in the focus, or the space that you were just talking about, Roxana, how can we see them as a way to change politics as well?
Well, I think that I think a museum has a very powerful role. It is an institution where there are communities participate, but I can only, I have one example, and that was, there was a pressure group that didn't like the issue that we were talking, we had an exhibition about the whole issue of decolonization, and they took us to court, and it was a political party, and we changed the politics and the tone of that particular challenge that we had, because we went to court, we challenged it, and we said we uphold human rights, freedom of expression, and definitely we will stand by what we want to. And so that particular exhibition remained, and people engaged with it, and there were people who disliked it, but there were also people who said, yay, we think that it's very important that diverse views are discussed on this space, and that perhaps it does shape the narrative of the culture we have in our country.
Yeah. Well, I would say that's a great ending and a great takeaway for this deep dive session. Thank you very much for taking your time, Roxana, to answer this question and to engage in this conversation and to be part of the Martin Roth Symposium in general. And also thank you very much to Nico Daswani, for our first responder, who took the time and who will leave us at this point as well. Next up in this program will be the sprint by Hartmut Dogalo, who is the director of the Humboldt Forum, the general director of the Humboldt Forum, who talks about museums and empowerment. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the program, and I see you and hear you in the next deep dive.
Goodbye.
Ja, schönen guten Tag und hallo hier.
Good afternoon and hello from Berlin. Behind me, you see the work done by kids dealing with the Berlin Palace. Starting at the end of the year, we plan to open the Humboldt Forum. This is going to be a new and exciting building, and this is precisely what I would like to talk about today. We do not really yet know how the Humboldt Forum is going to work. It will be a new experience for all of us, but what we know already is that Humboldt Forum will not be a classic traditional museum. What is it then? It's a cultural center, an international platform for dialogue, a place where different actors and players may meet, and where on the one hand it's about global diversity, and on the other about a very specific situation here in Berlin. And it's also about working not just with exhibitions, but also with artistic, scientific, intellectual formats, from dance to performance, from discussions to flash mob and yoga and literature. So we will have a very broad-based, colorful program with lots of different focal points in trying to grapple with the history and the present. What is a museum? We all seem to have thought about that and have argued heatedly. The argument is particularly hot at the moment, but the question really is, what do we mean by power? When we translate it into German, it's a rather difficult and complex word. It may mean anything from absolute domination, influence, but also violence. But power, of course, also has to do with driving force, strength, competence, in the meaning of empowering, of propelling things forward. Let's just think of electric power. So it adds lots of different angles to the debate. I would like to focus on how I see the term in context with museums. I see the museum as a powerhouse, as a power station to empower people, to support them, to enable them to do what they want to do. Humboldt Forum, I think, is well prepared to take on that role, the role of a power station, a driving emancipatory force. One thing is clear, cultural institutions, as many other things in the 21st century, are confronted with new challenges, but also with changing demands. It's not just the cultural institution itself that has to change. What is also changing is the museum as a Western invention. Globalization, multipolar worlds, multicultural social systems, pluralistic ways of thinking, all these influence the museum as an institution, no doubt about it, just as the content of the collections and the presentation of these collections. It has come up against new limiting factors, has to respond to a new context and take these new discourses into consideration. A change of paradigm is very obvious. It is no longer about an elitist institution such as a theater or an academy for a small selected circle. The museum of today and tomorrow needs to be a public edifice, a multi-purpose building, something like a railway station, which is there for everyone. Then the museum has a special demand with regard to its social relevance. And this relevance may even grow. And when it is courageous enough to invite different views of the world, it can be a place for critical public debates, for the politicization, for self-awareness and self-empowerment processes. Art and culture are tools to activate such a process, and they can be very radical tool to send out radical messages. When cultural institutions such as a museum want to be socially relevant and be regarded as important establishments of knowledge, they need to change, they need to open up, they need to overcome boundaries and empower the audience. Museums empower. What do we need for that? I think we need two components. One component is an open place, and the other is an open structure. As far as the Humboldt Forum is concerned, an open place means to be open to all people who happen to be in Berlin and want to find out what this place is. It will be open 24/7. The inner courtyards, the portals will be open, not hermetically sealed. This is a good precondition in order to redefine a cultural institution that wants to reach out to the public, attracting many people and getting them into contact. This is why we have called it forum. Yet it is a forum that understands itself as a new place from the point of view of different actors and offer what it wants to see as important to the audience. who can then use it actively and become part of the forum itself. The Berliner Museum, the Local History Museum, and Humboldt University with its collections, and we, the Humboldt Forum Foundation, we all contribute different perspectives, different DNAs, and different interests to the new place. Basically, it's about a communal residence where residents have to try to enhance the potential they all have and to accept that we cannot be just as we want to be, but that we have to respond to what the others are and want to be. And it's not just about 2 or 3 cultural practices, either permanent exhibitions or temporary exhibitions, or theater or music. It's about embedding things, mixing up things, trying out different cultural practices from performative to visual, cognitive, other approaches, just as we are seeing in the current developments in the fine arts, in theater and music, where we see that the boundaries are dissolving, that the genres are overlapping, and the Humboldt Forum wants to be such an open space. The other component, the second component for the empowerment of the museum, and for a museum to become an emancipatory driving force, is the open form, the open structures, because sensory perceptions can only be changed by museums when a different life experience is offered in the same way, in a relevant way. And then we will be able to find new commonalities by making multi-perspective approaches possible. We can live a multipolar world, and we need to build bridges in order not to wipe out the differences, but to overcome what hinders us. The model of cooperation, collaboration is the main principle of how the Humboldt Forum wants to work. Cultural institutions such as the Humboldt Forum are no longer a depository of collections or archives. They are a creative force, which we see in the current discussion about how to deal with the colonial heritage, how to deal with collections put together in a colonial context with regard to the question of restitution. Here, museums can be cultural centers of a new type, powerhouses, power stations, to be adaptable and to be a political place that responds to social and political process of change. I'm looking forward to the discussion in the deep dive. Thank you.
It's been said that, like governments, we get the museums that we deserve, that states give their citizens the cultural institutions that reflect back who they are and who they aspire to be, offer up a kind of received history, present the particular lessons that their citizens can accept. And though we'd like that to be a neat, uncontested process, so often it isn't. Crafting museum narratives is quite rightly difficult, complex, fluid, contested. Visit most museums and you might not imagine that to be the case. In the museums that I grew up in, it was hard not to take away that the substantive global narrative of the 19th century was defined by Europe. It was defined by a very particular kind of power, by empire, by exploration, by the exertion of economic and military control, and of cultural power. The 20th century, by contrast, was defined by different kinds of power, a time of global conflagration, of competing global cultures, and of a foregrounding of the self. So the 19th century personified by men like Darwin, seeking to collect and curate the world into a kind of coherence. The 20th century by figures like Freud and Picasso and Miles Davis, who sought to craft maps to help us understand ourselves, to chart our interior landscapes. And what they all share is their relationship to power, usually Western, usually male, so often white. These are, for many, comforting historical narratives that place us and the people and people like us at the very heart of our own story. Our monuments, our museums, our histories are driven by protagonists who reflect back our image and our values. But I dream of another vision for museums. My 4 a.m. reimagining of the world is one of other museum narratives, of other lenses and other perspectives on history and power. I, for instance, reimagined the First World War as a story of that same span of history as the one that we're taught in schools, but driven by similar causalities of those celebrated in our museums, but one that incorporates a different set of voices, different victors, different victims, different theatres, different consequences. There's a history of that war in which it's acknowledged that the very first shots of the First World War were actually fired by an African in Africa, an African of the Gold Coast Regiment. It could be a version of history that would tell the story of the war that would call upon 4 million people of colour, mobilised into European and American armies, of the very first naval battle unfolding in East Africa, of hundreds of thousands of Africans who fought and many who made the ultimate sacrifice. It was Africans upon whose literal backs that the war was won. Some 2 million African workers, soldiers, porters lost their lives on battlegrounds in Africa and abroad, fighting for the interests of those who were jockeying for a place in the scramble for Africa. And indeed, across the British Empire, its people set aside their own ambitions for self-autonomy and freedom to fight for the cause of their colonizer, perhaps hoping that in that post-war landscape, they might have the opportunity to renegotiate equity. My own grandfather, who spent his life campaigning against colonialism, would, like so many, raise funds for the purchase of reconnaissance planes to aid the war effort. Because at the time, denying one's own political aspirations for the war effort felt right. And those kinds of patterns of sacrifice were replicated across varied sociologies. When war broke out, the women's suffrage movement in Britain immediately scaled back its activities. Emmeline Pankhurst, the leading suffragette, remarked that there was no point in continuing to fight for the vote when there might be no country in which one could vote. As men left their jobs to fight, suffragette leaders volunteered their members to take their place. And these kinds of patterns of marginalised people putting their own interests to one side, sacrificing their own interests to the needs of the war, is commonplace. Uhuru Yatote, one of the great Mau Mau freedom fighters, he recalls his time in the African forces at the Burmese front. And he recounts a conversation with a white soldier who asked him quite bluntly, "What do you think you're fighting for? At least if I die in the war, I will know it will be for my country. But if you're killed, what will you have gained?" And that sort of question must have been asked across the world by individuals fighting on varied fronts and for a cause that ultimately denied them their rights. I can only imagine that they believed that from a victory, a new set of equalities would evolve. And in many ways, they were right. The 20th century would be subsequently defined by a struggle for liberation, by the burgeoning of women's rights and the struggle for freedom of peoples of colours, by chipping away at Enlightenment certainties, and of the slowly developing tolerance and acceptance of once peripheral voices. The best cultural institutions embraced those changes, but so often museums held on to Enlightenment models and told that flattening history that continued to reflect old values and narrow views. And a century on from the First World War, those same echoes of political resistance pervade. In Me Too and in Black Lives Matter, the political descendants of women's suffrage and Pan-African movements have found a new voice. And as at the turn of the 20th century, those poignant calls for change have echoed wider aspirations for freedom and justice. And though it feels like history is repeating itself, we as a museum sector must not make the same mistakes of our history, of resisting or ignoring that ambient shift in thinking. I'm determined that V&A East will not just reflect these shifts in discourse, but we will be flexible and open enough to ongoingly shift our thinking to embrace new voices and new perspectives. I'm hoping that V&A East will become a place of transformation, a catalyst of self-actualization and realization, where the marginal and the quiet will find an emotional and intellectual home. Ironically, my inspiration for this is not a current figure or ambient politics, but one from V&A's past. Henry Cole, the founder of the V&A, was an extraordinary individual who sought to build an institution that had the foresight and the ambition to benefit the marginalized. When in 1849 he visited the 11th Quinquennial Paris exhibition, he returned home disappointed at what he saw. He saw the critical omission of international participants. He felt to make a truly great cultural statement, it had to be global, it had to be inclusive. And his great exhibition would mark itself out from all that preceded it with its truly international intent. He lays out a case that would aspire to be truly global, to be diverse, to be universal. He believed in a kind of universal connection between peoples across geography and time, a connection that was most palpable through contact with cultural excellence, through making. He wanted to celebrate that making with the greatest exposition the world had ever seen. And we all know how successful it was, not just as a national phenomenon, but also because it drew people from across the globe as participants and as audiences. 60,000 foreign nationals came to London for the Great Exhibition in a moment that would help to redefine Britain as a great cultural crucible, as a truly global cultural force. And as we craft our new museum, V&A East in London, we want to build upon that cold drive for global and for the global and for the marginal by building a new museum amongst some of the most economically disadvantaged communities in Europe. These are communities that have never had a worthy local platform through which to draw inspiration for their dreams, institutions that could shape those dreams into professional disciplines, until now. We want V&A East to feel like a place of refuge, as a long overdue investment in skills and opportunity, a worthy platform for this geographic engine of creativity. We want to create this, to make the center feel like the periphery and to make the periphery feel like the center, to capture this moment of burgeoning change to an institutional culture of change. To not just be the place that tells the story of the 21st century, but one that hosts those that are crafting it and offers them the space to realize that change. The new cultural landscape requires a new kind of institution, one that can re-energize its collections for new audiences and recalibrate itself to the concerns and rhythms and the modes of production of the once marginalized. The V&A has an extraordinary once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build that institution, creating a world-first experiential storehouse of art and design in a new collection centre, and pairing it with the experimental partnership-based gallery and exhibition platform in a new museum. Taken together, we'll create a new campus for the imagination, a home for rebels and for visionaries. We look forward to exploring more in the deep dive.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. It is an honor for me to be here at this event. And I'm glad to share a little experience of my work in the context of the National Museum of Ethnography and Folklore. In the museum, it was necessary to work on the practices. I had a project with 900 women weavers in the community where I wanted to understand the theory of the praxis, means how the practice of building an object is done. In the communities, the people who create these objects that are in the museum's collections understand in a more fluid way how to do that work, how the operational chain works. Because often in the museums, as collectors, we do not understand this operational chain. For the weavers, the craftswomen, the artists, in the different fields, the operational chain is so important. For example, obtaining the raw material, or the mutual breeding of the raw material, the treatment of the raw material, the processing of the object. And from this elaboration, we come directly to the topic of the chronology in archaeological, historical, and ethnographic terms. Thanks to this dynamic, we can also understand what the social life of the object is and its social interaction. That is why it is so important to understand the whole issue of the operational chains, to understand how the object is constructed, is built, and what are the terminologies of this operational chain. In linguistic terms, it's very important to understand the structure of these inputs, means what terminology is used for the mutual breeding, for example, in terms of the plants and the animals. Then the same goes for obtaining the raw material, for the techniques, what instruments are used to transform the raw material. In this sense, it has been very important to understand these logics of the linguistic entries in their own logic of the objects, whether it comes from Aymara, Quechua, Guarani, all the regional languages, so that we can understand the structure and proceed and flow in a different way. This construction of understanding the operational chain has automatically questioned us in the museum, like how the collections are organized. Often the collections are organized solely according to the criteria of conservation and preservation. And in terms of conservation and preservation, one can state that we only care and research about beauty, for example, what iconography and what color is used. And often we do not understand the logic of the operational chain. So for us, that logic proposes to the museum directly how to understand these approaches. When I entered the National Museum of Ethnography and Folklore, there were two very important collections. The collections of cultural good and the collection of documents. And within these two collections, there was in the past not enough research to understand the dynamics of the collection management. So it was obvious to understand that the whole collections was really like screaming, I'm science, I'm technology, I'm identity, I'm culture, I'm economy. And that's like how the different single objects came out. And for this reason, it has been important to change the dynamics, even in terms of the structure of the discussion. Often we focus, for example, on the issue to understand the things about beauty, what means beauty, elegance, and what is preserved best. But on the other hand, we do not understand the operational chain of these specific inputs, which is very important, like, for example, how the raw material is processed and where it comes from, how it passes from one community to another, from one region to another. For example, the cotton traveling to the Altiplano, and from the Altiplano, how the fiber of the camelid travels to the valleys and the tropics. This helps us to understand the movements of trade in the raw materials involved in an object. Then all these dynamics of movement makes us understand things completely differently, such as, for example, the transportation of clay from one region to another region for its processing, and then from that processing, the created object travels again to another region. Or the exchange means doing things in different regions, and how to be able to understand the tradition and culture in the social life of the object itself, what role the object plays. And in that sense, it was very important to get into the dynamics of multidisciplinary understanding from social sciences. Anthropology, archaeology, linguistics, history, so that we have a more comprehensive information. For example, biology regarding of the specific subject of feathers. By analyzing the DNA, you know which bird it comes from, whether the bird was alive or dead. Then these dynamics change. Instead of putting responsibility only into one curatorship, you get a broad vision from various points of view. Thanks to this logic, we created those 500-page catalogs presenting our thoughts from the operational chain, the chronology, to the social life of the object in its interaction. These dynamics lead us to a self-questioning of the past trends of the academic studies of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, which often do not have the logic to understand, for example, the construction of the object. It's more like a specialization towards the beautiful, the cute, which very often is well known. This has been very important for us to understand this force field of an object construction from the linguistic structures for its translation. If it has been done in Aymara, for example, to pass it on to Spanish or another international language like English. These dynamics have made us question ourselves and enable us to overcome the gap between theory, because much research is done on the theoretical side, and the practical side, building a bridge of connectivity between both sides, which can work with the appropriate terminologies. In many cases, they are very separate. There is the practical part, which is only handled with practical language for those who do the practical work. And there is another academic language that is only built for the academics. So it's the language that separates us between theory and practice, which often have no connection. They're very separate, and we need to bring together these two sources of information, both theory and practice, so that we can have a more complete information and can improve our work in the future. So thanks to all that information, what we do is we build that bridge, both in the academic production and in the debate. For the debate, it is very important to have these international conferences where the theoretical side of the academics and to have also the complementary viewpoint of the practical part of the artisans and of the artists. And this complementary of both the producer and artist and academic side has been necessary to build this bridge so that we can have a better flow of understanding how, for example, the collections work from these both perspectives. And this helps us to make a dramatic change in the exhibitions themselves. For example, to be able to have a look, a perception of the three dimensions, not only from one dimension. In many cases, for example, the textile is fixed into a frame and placed against the wall. But this is not the important bit for the weavers, but rather to look at the obverse and the reverse, to understand the three-dimensionality. Then automatically the curatorship changes completely and makes us think in terms of the practice of the theory.
So welcome, dear participants, and welcome again to this deep dive session from wherever you are following us to this deep dive with Hartmut Dorgalow, General Director of the Humboldt Forum in Berlin, and Benita von Malzahn, Director of Global Cultural Engagement of the Volkswagen Group. My name is Fabian, and I will be your host for the next two deep dives. We are very happy to have you two with us. And with that, you will take the time to answer the questions. So thank you too. Just a short note on how you can participate in this deep dive. If you have a question, there are three ways to include them in this discussion. The first one is via direct audio in this webinar. Please click on the raise your hand icon, which you can find in the menu bar at the bottom of your screen. As soon as it is your turn, I will call you by name and enable your audio. Please unmute yourself so you can ask your question. And as soon as you have asked it, we'll turn off your audio again. Your video won't be used. If you prefer, you can also ask the question by writing in the chat of this webinar, or you use our online forum at campus.re-publica.com if you are following from our website or YouTube. So we will include those questions as well coming through campus.re-publica.com. And I would say, let's start. Let's begin with Benita von Malzahns reaction to the sprint by Hartmut Dorgelo.
Thank you, Fabian. Hello, Hartmut, and nice to meet you because we haven't in real life. So
nice to meet you too. Hello, Benita.
It was, first of all, actually, I like to say that I really like the drawing behind you. Listening to you and looking at the drawing, because if I can see it rightly on the left, there's a lot of people, I'm not quite sure if they're on the roof, if they're in the sky, but there's a lot of human beings experiencing the Schloss or the Forum. And I think that's something that you said, that it's important, it should be open, it should be an open space for all people. So I sort of like the drawing behind you, this comes across. You also said, and that I thought was very interesting, it should be, the role should be a power station and to empower people and get everyone to come and go. It's 24/7. A lot of the work that we do is also about giving as much people as possible access to art and culture. And I think it's important that we do that, especially maybe in Berlin. I'm not so sure if our museums are maybe a little bit, you know, people don't, I don't know, they're not scared, but they don't go maybe as much as they should. And I think if they have an open space like you will have, like you said it will be, we're all really excited, where dialogue can happen, where lots of different things can happen, and you don't need to be scared to go because you pick why you go and what you want to see and what you want to experience. I think that's something that will be really good for the city, and people will, you know, take it and enjoy it, and a lot of dialogue and creativity will come out of it. So I think that's, it's really, I'm very much looking forward to seeing in the end what it will all be. So
it's the same for us, because we are talking about the future, and we hope that we will start with the opening end of this year. And thank you first for mentioning the painting behind me. It was made by, or created by pupils from Berlin as part of one of our activities in preparing the cultural program with school kids from Berlin. And so it is a very good inspiration for me because it's behind my desk.
I would like to give the word or give the floor to Katarzyna. Katarzyna, you have the chance to speak. Please unmute your microphone.
Hello, thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I have a question. You're saying a lot about empowerment and access, about the 24/7 access to the forum. Can you tell, how does the Humboldt Forum empower the public? Like, give specific examples. And does the forum share power with the public? Is it just the access, or the public actually gains some sort of power as well?
Thank you for this question. I think it's very complex, and you are describing our biggest challenge, how to create an open space, a real forum, without dominating it. It's to create an open space where everybody can go in, just drop in, and enjoy what we are offering on the one hand side, and on the other side, bringing their own opinions, their own wishes, their own positions into our programming. And so we are working in different fields, not only in cultural program, but also in education and in exhibition making, in various kinds of presentations, not only exhibitions, permanent and temporary. And so what we want to create is just really an open house, an open space where you can just enjoy watching the skyline of Berlin, visiting the roof terrace, and enjoying a good coffee there. This is also a way how to use the building, or how to enjoy what the building offers. But on the other side, it is our interest to learn from people not only visiting the building, and that is why digital technologies and digital ways of communications will be playing a very important part of our work and of our program to invite people from other parts of the world to become a partner in creating what we call the Humboldt Forum. So we are not talking about a museum. Of course, we are presenting, we are exhibiting collections, but it's not only presenting it, it is how to deal, how to work, how to use this as a material for other questions, for your questions. So that's the complexity is something to create a bridge between a location manager on the one hand side and on the other side of a program manager, how to create a program inviting people. So that's something we try to do. And that means we are not doing this alone. We are doing this with various partnerships with different partners, with different audiences. And so we hope that it is something not only important for Berlin, but also for other communities.
There was one question coming in through our online tool at campus.republica.com, which I think refers to your statement, Benita, which asks, how can we make people less scared of museums, especially in the case of Berlin, as people tend to be scared to go museums? And maybe you can also describe what you are doing to make people less scared of the Humboldt Forum.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, scared isn't the right word. I didn't really want to use that, but I know that because we've supported, there is a free entry day at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin once a month, every Thursday. And we asked people that came, we did a research if they normally go to museums or why they don't go, and was it just because of the entry? And I think, or the entry fee. I don't think it is just because of the entry fee, but it helps if they know they can always go there. And I think maybe at the Humboldt Forum it will also be good that they can have a lot of different programs. So it's not just the exhibition or the collection. They go and see and might say, I don't even know if I know enough about it, because they don't need to know a lot about it. They should, learn. That's why they should go. So I could imagine that the Humboldt Forum people will feel more relaxed to go and say, I can choose. I mean, that's how I imagine it will work. There'll be lots of different programs and exhibitions and performances, you said, so they can choose and see what they would like to experience.
Perhaps I can add two other points, perhaps more technically. The one is we have different opening hours comparing to other traditional museums. So we try to be open longer so that there's not such a sharp cut between the opening hours of the exhibition and the cultural programs in the evening, for example. And this is one thing. And the other thing, the Humboldt Forum will be free of charge. So you can just drop in, go up to the rooftop, or just jump into one of the museum exhibitions, and also of some special exhibitions. In some other cases, we will charge an entrance fee for concerts, for dance performances, for lectures, for whatever. So, but it will be always a combination of something that is free. It is a little bit like, it's not a shopping mall, it is a shared apartment. So you can jump into one room to see what happened there, and perhaps it's free. And then, of course, you have to buy a ticket for some special activities and performances. So it will be a combination. And we hope that we will attract people just coming along. It's located on the main tourist axis between Brandenburger Tor and Alexanderplatz in Berlin. And on the other side, we hope that people who are not interested in the colonial past or in museum collections will come for a yoga class, or for a theater performance, or for some drawing lessons, or whatever we will offer.
We have one more question coming in through our online tool at campus.riem-publica.com. Paula is asking that Kavita Singh stated in her sprint on Monday, so yesterday, that even though museums remain the same institutions globally, their function is very different when it comes to their social function. So how would you describe the social function of the Humboldt Forum?
I think there are at least two functions. One is for the local or for the regional audience. It is a new cultural hotspot worth to visit. It is something that tried to create this new space of experiences, bringing together art and academics and performing art with museums and so on. And the other purpose could be something for an audience internationally. That means not only as a reason for coming to Berlin, because many of the people we are working with are not able, or for them it's not so easy to go to Europe as just getting a visa. So it starts with these very basic problems. But to create a space that allows us to find new ways of communication about our common past. That means mostly about the colonial past, about the Western dominated periods of history, about our understanding. I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And I think it is part of our history that was always overshadowed by the crimes during the Nazi regime and by the period of two German states. So I think could be something like a platform for common learning about an overshadowed part of our common history. And that is, I think, is something that is important not only for a national or a regional audience. It is something it's important also for partners worldwide.
And we have 3 minutes left in this deep dive, and at the moment, no further questions. So I'd like to ask you, Benita, whether you, as you haven't met personally, if you have any question concerning the Humboldt Forum or concerning the sprint that we heard to Hartmut Togalu.
Yes, I do actually. You said that you're 4 different institutions working together. How will they work together?
Oh, that's something what we try to learn, because these are important institutions, the Humboldt University, the state museums. They have their own history, their own, as we call it, DNA. And so we try to create a new way of partnership, because we believe that there are many things we can share, and that many things exist we can learn from each other via sharing. So it is something like coming together and creating and joining a shared apartment with institutions without having any experience in joining these ways. But we have something together that means our audience. We will have one audience, and we are talking about the Humboldt Forum, but it will be not only based on 3 or 4 pillars, it will be also organized by 4 actors. And so this is finding a balance between your own programs and what you are doing together, like what we call a WG in Deutschland, a shared apartment.
So there will be programs. So it won't just be a location and 4 different institutions in there, but there'll actually be cooperation between and...
Yeah, one website. So the audience have not to switch from one website to another. There will be only one program we offer to everyone. But it will be created by different partners from different sources.
I would like to include one more question before we come to an end of this deep dive by Julia Gonella, who was also asking through campus.republica.com. With so many different activities, does the Humboldt Forum keep a focus and above all a vision? And what do you think will it contribute to for the young generation?
What's young? I think one of our main activities will be in this field of education. And so I'm a little bit jealous, because in English, education combines Bildung und Erziehung. That's a slightly but important difference in German language. So that it's not only a place of learning, but also a place of understanding. And so we are preparing a lot of activities in this field, and we will start. And this should show also how important the younger generation is for us. We will start with an exhibition that is dedicated to kids between 6 and 12. The title is Take a Seat. As the Humboldt Forum will take a seat in the city, every generation and every culture has its own tradition in sitting and seating, and we will talk about this. So it will be a tour d'horizon through all kinds of sitting, of placement, and I think it will be not only something educative, but will be also a lot of joy joining this workshop or this atmosphere of a learning space and an experience space we will create, and we will start with this in January next year. So, and perhaps it's not only for the kids, but also for their parents and grandparents.
That sounds like a really exciting place to start sitting. So I would say I look very much forward to the opening. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer our questions. And it was wonderful to have you with us, Hartmut Dogolo. Benita will remain with us for the next deep dive with Gus Casely-Hayford, whose sprint you already saw. So thank you again, Hartmut, and we will continue in just a minute.
Thank you.
So welcome back, dear participants, and welcome new participants, especially Gus Casely-Hayford, the director of V&A East. Still with us is Benita von Malzahn, Director Global Cultural Engagement at Volkswagen Group. And I would like you to explain just in a short moment to how you can participate in this deep dive. You can use your direct audio in this webinar by clicking raise your hand. You can also ask the question in writing in the chat in this webinar, or you use your online form at campus.republica.com, and we can include those questions as well. I would like to start out right away with a short reaction by Benita to Gus's talk and to the sprint that we just heard.
Hi, Gus.
Good evening, Benita.
It's really lovely to meet you, especially because I've had so many times with Martin talking about the V&A East. He wasn't only passionate about it, but I think it was, which he definitely was, but it was of great importance to him what this museum could be, should be, where a museum should be going. So it was really exciting for me to hear what you were saying, because you know, all these ideas that Martin had, I think in the end definitely are coming out to what you will be producing, I think. I think the idea of you telling us about the history and where we come from and what museums were done for, and you said, you know, government sort of, it reflected what governments tell us to do a little bit, and that we need to be more open about that, and that it needs to reflect everyone's wishes and ideas and thoughts. Yeah, I mean, Martin already, I think in the V&A and with Martin at the V&A was something where he always did something new, something, for me, one experience was a project I did with him. He did an exhibition called The Season of Engineering. And so, of course, he came to Volkswagen, but he said, you know, everyone says designers are artists. Why is an engineer not an artist as well? An engineer is a designer. So, you know, this is something I think which is fascinating, to always start something new, and that was important to him. So listening to you about what your ideas now are for V&A East, I'm really, really excited about it. And yeah, maybe you can just tell a little bit more about, yeah, you said it needs to reflect the whole, you know, it needs to shift, it needs to be different. What exactly are we going to be experiencing? I know there'll be a storage house of art and design, there'll be lots of galleries, but what are you going to do to exactly what you said, to get everyone more involved, to come there and to experience what they should be experiencing, what you are hoping for them to experience?
I only had the privilege of meeting Martin on 2 occasions. And the second occasion was when I was actually part of a panel that was awarding the Museum of the Year. And we had to select from a huge number of different museums. It was it was difficult because the pressure was not to give the prize to another London museum, but Martin's V&A was such a compelling institution with a narrative which really it speaks even now, a number of years later, to our time. And the way in which Martin expressed what he saw as the ambition of museums, it really spoke to me in a very powerful way. And it's the thing which I quietly carry with me, is that sense that museums are more than just repositories of objects, more than just spaces in which we display and tell the stories of our histories and particularly our victories, but that there is this opportunity for us to actually engage in transformation of communities, to bring new communities into debates about who we might be, what we might be, how we might actually forge a new positive agenda which might be shared. And it's that really inspired me in thinking both about applying for this job that I was working up until fairly recently in America at the National Museum of African Art, but this role which would be standing on the shoulders of a true giant of our sector, Martin, and forging something which would fulfill that incredible ambition that he had of speaking to wide audiences in ways that would actually liberate them to reflect back to us the possibilities for our discipline. And that was the thing that really inspired me. And that is what we have tried to engender in our initial vision for this institution, as a crucible of possibilities, a space in which we can come and we can actually remake disciplines in ways that will really empower the visitor. And for many people who live in and around that bit of London, they may never have engaged with a museum in the sorts of ways that we do on a regular basis. And so we wanted to find ways of changing their lives. Sorry, I'm sorry.
And give the audience a chance to ask a question. We have one question by Katarzyna, who wants to ask her question via audio.
Thank you very much for your passionate and inspiring talk. And my question, today's session is a lot about meeting expectations of current societies and about empowerment. It sounds doable to me for a small or medium-sized museum. And V&A is one of the greatest museums in the world, especially once the V&A East is open. So what, in your view, is possible to be done at this scale, and what is not?
These are good questions. And I do think for us that we are both a national and a local institution, that we are surrounded by some of the most economically challenged regions of Britain, some of the most diverse and also culturally inspired as well, but also economically, that these are people who face enormous challenges. And part of the reason that both local and national government have invested in our institutions' idea of placing both our new collection centre, which will hold 250,000 objects and 900 archives, and also a new museum which will be local to it, which will be a space in which we will explore not just those collections, but also special exhibitions on all sorts of different areas which celebrate making. That will be a 4-story new building, which is designed by Liz Diller. That these two institutions, that we are hoping that they will become spaces that give those local people a sense of both the possibilities of design and a way of interacting with the best global practice, but also spaces in which they can realize some of their own dreams. A collection center which can be used as a resource, a source book for for inspiring their own ideas. But we also have a national responsibility. And I want to speak to that because we have limited resource. I want to speak to that national responsibility through digital tools, through partnerships, and also through thinking of ways in which we work actively to loan our collections. But beyond that as well, we are in this incredibly diverse bit of London, and we need to find ways of bringing practice from across the globe that reflects that complexity and speaks to that demographic complexity. And so we will be working with partners from around the world in engaging in developing program, bringing artists, bringing academics and curators into our space to reshape our ideas. So I see us as being both a global and also a local institution that will try to deliver, whether it be through exhibitions or digitally, the sorts of things which will particularly engage a younger audience. And within that, I would see success only as measurable in the way in which we actually reflect the diversity and demographic complexity of London, and particularly the local boroughs around the institution.
I would like to ask another question by John, who asked through our online tool. In your sprint, you talked about a flat or flattened narrative that needs to be changed. I share your opinion, but how can that be actively changed? How do museums contribute to that narrative shifting?
Well, we're very fortunate in which we have this incredible collection of amazing material culture that can tell all kinds of stories that, of course, those stories can be authored by curators, by historians who can underpin those objects with very rigorous research and information. But around that are also the possibilities for us to engage in conversations about these objects, potentially as objects of utility, of inspiration, of lust, of hate, potentially, but to dynamize the space around those objects with wider conversations which will engage all kinds of people. So what I would love is that we build a nexus of conversations around our collection, which is not controlled by us, but which is something which is co-curated and shared with our audiences. And the great thing about that digital space is that it need not just be people who come and visit, that it could be the practitioners who have created the traditions that have evolved into our actual objects, or it may well be people who have been inspired to use those objects in changing their own practice. And so I would want this to not just be a repository of objects that one comes and looks at, but as a catalyst for a kind of dynamic dialogue with all kinds of creative communities across the world. And in that way, it may well be an institution that is based in East London, but I would love it if the peoples of Berlin, the creative communities of Berlin, could be using it as a resource for inspiring their practice, for conversations with people working in similar areas of practice. And I think in that way that we can dynamize our collection, which tells 5,000 years of history, in ways that speak to this moment and also which inspire the future.
I would like to include one more question before we have to come almost to an end of this deep dive, because it comes by Giovanna, who was asking through our chat, and she's also referring to your audience. She asks if you can talk more about the communities living around V&A East, who are, as you said, some of the poorest in London and the UK, many of whom were also displaced by the 2012 Olympic Games and subsequent gentrification. So how can you make your venue really accessible and appealing to them?
Yeah, and it is a challenge, and that I've spent quite a bit of my summer holiday cycling in the 4 boroughs which surround our site, and they aren't communities who have enjoyed the benefits of state-sponsored culture for the most part. You know, these are people who are engaged in culture in a variety of different ways, but they pay for their culture. That these are people who who are probably least able to do so, but we don't give them the benefit of subsidized culture. And so one of the ways in which I feel that we can actually speak to them is that these are some of the youngest communities in London as well, is through schools and through colleges, is that if we can get in both formally through the curriculum, but also informally through building networks within those schools to speak to those communities and hopefully draw them into more than just being visitors, but being participants in helping us to think about our programs. And then beyond that, wanting them to be advocates, ambassadors on the institution's behalf, to draw in maybe their parents, their relatives, so that they become our evangelists, our stewards within our institution. And we have a family of people who have an affinity with our institution and feel that, I think, like so many of us from ethnic minorities, that a museum visit may not have been a natural thing to consider as part of a recreational choice, but to make these institutions feel so natural to that generation that they will want to come and demand that it is remade in ways that they will love. And that's what I really want this space to be, is to be a space that will be a crucible for the imaginations of that younger generation, many of whom are going to reformulate disciplines in ways that are beyond our conception. But I want them to do that within our spaces as well as beyond it. I want us to be able to reflect the changes that are about to come, because I get the sense that Gen Z, that they aren't going to want the world to remain in stasis, that they want to see it change. And we want to be an institution that reflects that change, that dynamism.
I think that's also, for me, that's a great ending for this deep dive. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Just one more question.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, take your time.
Do you already know when you'll open?
It's two buildings. So the collection center, which holds the 250,000 objects and 900 archives, that will be open 2023, possibly a year, 8 months to a year later, the museum site. So, please, if before that point that you are in London, do look me up. And if there are ways that we can get you in to see the buildings as they transform into their complete state, do come and see, because they are both beautiful buildings.
Thank you.
So that was a very nice ending as well, and a great invitation. So thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you for to the two of you for being part of the Mars program. The Mars program continues on the stream on our website and on YouTube with the Future Forward panel. I think a great lookout to MuseumFutures by upcoming museum shapers. Today, Yvette Mutumba, whose print you already saw, editor-in-chief at Contemporary and is with us, as well as Yara Haridi, a PhD student at the Museum für Naturkunde. Thanks to the two of you again. Have a nice evening and have fun with the rest of our program.
Thank you.
So, welcome to this second day of the symposium, to another Future Forward talk. My name is Sarah Berg, and once again, we are closing the conference with two guests, one forward-thinking professional and a student responder to collect their viewpoints and critical notes to the topic of the day. Today, we've heard a lot about power sharing, and the museum as a powerhouse. My big thank you goes to our speakers for your powerful thoughts and ideas to be brought in. It is now my pleasure to continue this heartbeat with Dr. Yvette Mutumba and Yara Haridi. Welcome to the two of you. Yara Haredi is a PhD student studying the evolution of bone cells at the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin. Her research looks at how bone cells might tell us more about extinct animal metabolism, genome, and physiology. She blogs about her research. You can find her at thebarebones.org, and she is working as a science communicator. Yvette Mutumba, editor-in-chief, as you already heard, of Contemporary and Contemporary and America Latina. She worked as a curator at the Weltkulturmuseum Frankfurt am Main in Germany, and later as part of the curatorial team of the 10th Berlin Biennale for Contemporary Art in 2018. Yvette is also curator at large at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam and currently lectures at the Institute of Art in Context, University of Arts in Berlin. So welcome. Thank you for being with us. So for this short talk, we would have a long list of power-relevant questions to be discussed. But maybe let me start with your definition, and I guess these are critical-minded definitions as well, of power in the arts and power in our art institutions. And maybe you also put in consideration that power lives in the programming, in the employees, in all those people involved in the working processes, and of course in the audience. So maybe Yvette, would you like to start with your definition or your thoughts?
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers of the symposium for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. It was really interesting to listen to the discussions and questions before, throughout the afternoon. So yes, I mean, for me, this question of power, it maybe starts in a way with what has been said before a lot, that power needs to be shared in institutions. And I think it is really, we have to be careful about this, how this doesn't become somehow this notion or a buzzword that is being used and that is not really filled. I think there lies a power in the ability of sharing power. And I think this is something that needs to be said also, that it is not only giving away something, but it's also a powerful thing to do, to share power, to acknowledge that sometimes it's time to make space. Another aspect is that it came up a lot, this question of power in terms of the relation to money and how funders and foundations and government funding can put pressure on institutions and organizations by deciding on whether they get money or by taking away money. So, I mean, I agree, there's a power to that. But what I felt hasn't really come up yet. I mean, I did miss a little bit of some of the other deep dives because of our technical testing session. But what I feel is really important to also not forget that power, that grassroots power that comes from, let's say, the other side. So you have this power here, you know, government, funding, and so on. But you also have the power that comes from here. And when I say from here, I mean, it is the power of the audience, it's the power of society, it's the power of cultural producers, it's the power of a young generation that does want to see other institutions. And I mean, I talk a lot with especially younger artists of color which question themselves what they can actually do in this moment right now, which goes beyond discussions and symposia and things like that. And I always keep saying, don't forget that you also have power. You have power by the way of saying, if someone invites you and you feel like that this institution is really more looking into tokenistic ideas of how they want to change their structures, then say no. I mean, of course, it's very a luxurious thing to do that. But if you can't afford to say no, because we all know you need the gig, you need the fee for the performance, for participation on the panel or whatsoever, then come with demands and requests and say, okay, yeah, thanks for the invitation. But if I really am supposed to participate, then please make sure that, I don't know, you do some workshops about diversity and discrimination in your staff, or just an example, to just, make that demand, because it's often this idea of, especially from cultural producer side, and especially from young cultural producers, that it is this big thing that you can enter an institution. So the museum invites you because that's the powerful institution. So you make it, if you make it into the institution. But especially in this moment right now, it's a lot about also, well, but they need you too. Because they are at this point where this pressure is really high. So they really depend also on that input and on those, strategies that come from cultural producers from outside the institution. And so I think that shouldn't be underestimated. And I think it's really time also to reevaluate these kind of hierarchies between who's like entering the institution, not only as in terms of the audience, which is something we can maybe talk about also in a minute, but also who are the producers that are being shown or presenting inside the institutions.
Thank you. Yeah, would you agree, or do you see it slightly from another angle because of your discipline as a researcher?
Right. So yeah, from the academic side, I agree with most of that. I would just add that there's the additional power of allowing someone's career to go forward. There is all these gatekeeping people, and when those people are not of diverse backgrounds or diverse life experiences, that power ends up being incredibly skewed. And that actually, to me, brings in the true definition of power, which is, in essence, the idea of shaping the future. That's when you have true power. You have the influence to shape who gets seen, who gets heard, where the money goes, who gets the positions to shape our future. And museums are in a very critical part of that because, as one of our amazing speakers said today, museums are these seed banks. So we get to take care of the future, but we also get to highlight that. And that's a power that needs to be shared and needs to be kind of moved around. And let's see what works, because what works for you might not work for the society you live in. And that kind of thing is continuously changing. So I think that's what power is.
Yeah. And maybe can I add something also?
Yeah.
Also this question of, because it ties in with what you just said, this, in which I hadn't mentioned, also this question of empowerment. So, which is a word that also has been used today. And I think this is I think really it's a word that shouldn't be used lightly. And I think in the question of definition of power, it's often also a definition how you use certain terms and who can empower whom. And I think this is not necessarily that always, the institution, for example, can decide whether they actually have the right to empower or whether it is wanted that they empower. So I think this is also a matter of dialogue. I mean, if you think of grassroots communities or projects, I mean, they empower, but this is because they grow. They grow over time. They have these dialogues. They have exchange. They build a community. And through that, they start to empower. But if an institution that is already there as this big machine decides, oh, now's the time to empower, I think it is in a way tricky, because then again, it's actually very, how you say that, paternalistic maybe, I don't know what the right word is, but in English, but just to say, because they decide now that they empower, but this is something that has to grow in a community. I think, and this is something institutions has to be very careful and aware about, how they start if they want to share power, which I think, of course, is a good thing if they start thinking about this.
Thank you very much, because empowerment, what we hear almost every day nowadays, is, like you say, a tricky thing. And yeah, I mean, if there is the idea of the museum as a powerhouse, or it sees itself as a public space, I mean, Did we not call it community centers in the past? I don't know. I'm not quite sure. And like you already said, Yvette, this comes from grassroots and bottom up, and not so much from corporate down. I don't know. But maybe to get a little deeper in that, what does it tell about power and power sharing? If the idea of dealing with empowerment is getting corporate.
I think what Yvette was trying to point to as well, and it is basically worrying that it's going to get co-opted by these institutions that have ignored this problem for so long, right? But at the same time, by not actively trying to empower people, they are empowering other people. Whether it's people who are from the past, whether it's people that, we shouldn't be agreeing with anymore. It's by not giving that platform to some people, you're automatically kind of giving it to others. And like you said, we have to be very specific about how we use that word empowerment and who is allowed to really be given power and by whom. And I think that's a really important question.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, you talk about this corporate idea of power. I think there it also is, if we talk about institutions, we also, of course, need to talk about funding institutions, how they use that power. I mean, Nico mentioned that earlier today, that there are a lot of funding institutions saying, okay, show us your program, show us your boards, show us, what you're doing, and then we tell you whether you get the money. But of course, this needs to be also introspectively reflected within those funding institutions, what that means, because suddenly it's this weird shift of power, that hops over there. And what does that actually mean? Apart from those questions, of course, how sustainable that is if these sort of programs stop maybe after 10 years, and how far then institutions are still feeling obliged to continue in the same spirit or attitude.
So maybe we could end and say, what is the challenge, but also chance, and maybe also the overwhelming when future museums want to be rather, would be like to be everything or serve like everything. So maybe is there, from your side, like what in your opinion is the minimum idea of a museum? Could you answer that?
The minimum ideal or idea?
Idea from your thinking. Mm.
I would say that the minimum that a museum does is serve its community, whether it's an art museum, whether it's a natural history museum. The point is to broaden the community's exposure to whatever your museum is about. It's for the community, first and foremost.
Yes, I agree. And I think in that sense also understanding who your community is really important part of that, because I think this also really quickly happens when we talk about how we use certain notions, that it is a lot talked about diversity and so on, and especially also in the German context, I'm not always really sure whether those people who talk about it are really aware how diverse the society around them is, or who the audience actually could be. So yeah, I totally agree. It really starts from there, and then and also in addition to that, I think it's also maybe to somehow acknowledge that a museum is not necessarily anymore, let's say, a space that only is this institution of knowledge, or that gives you knowledge, but that also understands that they have to be open for questions, or being questions, or maybe also posing questions in terms of what they show. And so it's not always the ultimate truth that's being produced through that institution. And I think that is kind of a minimum also, because I mean, I at least also still grew up in a way that you go into a museum and you read the wall text and you think that is the ultimate truth that's being told. And we do know, I don't know, but I do know by now that that's not necessarily the case. And so I think this is also kind of a bottom line from institutional side to sort of open that up and to really also mediate that toward the audience, that they say, look, we have this kind of knowledge, but you have that kind of knowledge. And so now let's come together, and see what that can actually create in that space provided by the institution.
I very much liked what Elvira elaborated about understanding and communicating the whole processing of things and handcrafting objects. I think it is really wonderful including this aspect so that museum visitors, remember Eva yesterday called them the museum users, understand, so that people understand, to learn about how she put it, the social life, or the Kraftfeld, you would say in German, the Kraftfeld and the social life of things that have been made to become objects in the past, as we know. Yara, as a researcher, you should be close to that concept of really getting into the circle of creating and understanding things from, let's say, the cell, is it? And how much would you like to present, let's say, open labs in museums to also show the public how research and your work to study the structure of organism and fabrication look like? Would you be fond of an idea like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big proponent of open labs or open preparation labs. So if, people are working on dinosaurs or whatever, and the way that they're prepared, people are almost always just as interested on how this animal came from the ground to be mounted into a museum, what process that was, how many humans were involved, what families were involved, what cultures were involved, who discovered it first? Oh, it was a little kid and his dog. And then they talked to this person, and the human aspect of it really gets people closer to the science. And I think that's a great, basically, delivery system for people to understand that, we don't just walk into museums and these skeletons are there or these specimens are there. There's a big human aspect to it, which of course is how a lot of bias comes in, but you teach people about that. And that's some of my favorite stuff, having open labs, having open collections, which is something that the Museum for Naturkunde is working on, having their collections accessible to the public. So they're no longer these dusty old rooms that are hidden away from everybody, but people can actually walk through them and understand the thought process and the wonder that a scientist gets, because scientists are just people that got curious, and the average person is just as curious. So when we open that up to people, I think that's when we can actually have good conversations.
Yvette, how about the social life behind or of pieces of handcraft or art?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree that this is really important to open up and make it accessible, to get this idea also. It ties in with a little bit what I said before, that this idea of what an institution or museum is and what kind of knowledge they provide, and that I think if you open it up and you have this opportunity to see the social life of these things that became then at certain point museum objects, but of course there were something else before. And also in what you said, in that process, the people are being involved. So that means also there are all these very subjective perspectives on the object that have been left in traces through the database, through the keywords that you find in the database. I mean, it's very different in a way how people in the 1930s would describe an object from, the Luba, I don't know, in an ethnographic museum, obviously, and how they would talk about the ethnic groups that would use it then today. And I think this is, of course, a huge, crazy, big work that would need to be done to actually go through this. But I think at least to start with this idea that this is, of course, not like an objective static thing, this kind of way of categorizing objects and how they're being presented. I think it's super important to get to this next step, how museums can really engage with their communities.
Just before, when we met, we talked a little bit about what Roxana mentioned in her concept of a new museum that she is calling a receptive and intuitive museum. Bringing in intuition, is this something that fascinates you, something that you would like to involve in your daily work, and how? Intuition, is there a chance to put it in methods and practices?
I mean, I really very much believe in intuition. Intuition also in the sense of being emotional about things, because I don't think being emotional has to be necessarily something negative or something unscientific or unexpert-like things. So I really believe, and I also use that in my daily practice. I mean, in the way how we run CN, but also in my curatorial work, it has a huge place as a methodology to think around intuition in regards to how you interact not only with the people or the network you work with, but also, of course, if it comes to artwork or choosing artwork and all these kind of things, to be less strategic about it by not saying, okay, this is an artist who has shown already 4 times in this institution, so maybe we should not show him because, and so on. You know, that often comes in, especially in curatorial practices, where you feel like you have to implement these kind of fact sheets, you know. And now I think a lot of curators are really affected by this pressure of having to be diverse and global and so on, that you have to, your checklist, and make sure, okay, do I have like my 5 artists from Africa? Do I have my 3 artists from, you know, I'm a bit exaggerating, but you see what I mean. And so for me, that's the opposite of being more intuitive about that, and speaking intuitively, also, you know, have this relationship with artwork and cultural production. So I think this is a very valid method, and I really love that idea of an institution that is intuitive and perceptive, but I just think it is also a very personal and very individual strategy, and then a museum is just this big machine, as we all know, and there are so many different individuals that come into play. So I think I can't, right now, I don't really know how, as a whole, an institution can be intuitive with coming in, you know, with all these subjective ideas. But I do think it is possible, maybe, you know, with growing together, and after a certain while, it might be possible that there are these moments or organizations that can actually act in that way.
Yeah, I agree with most of that. Yeah, intuition is something that we should basically be open to using, and it shouldn't be this kind of hidden thing. We don't have to boil down all our decisions into numbers and checklists. Sometimes we know that this is the right direction because we know, like we've taken all of our life experiences, and we know why this should be the direction the museum is going or this program is going. And in that way, I really think intuition can come into play in small parts of decision making, which then lead to, you know, power, basically. But of course, again, just to echo what she said, yeah, it's hard to think of how that would work on an institutional level because of how many people are involved in a decision and how many nuts and bolts have to turn for anything to actually happen at a museum. So I'm very intrigued on how that's actually going to come into play.
Okay, beautiful. So big thank you to the two of you. I don't know, is it a big step to tomorrow's topic of museum and entertainment? What would you say? When are you having fun in museums? Do you remember the last time?
I think the best way to educate or teach or basically share museum experiences is by making it enjoyable. There's no way you're going to get through to anybody without making it fun. You know, for me, it's entertain first and then educate second. And it has to be this fun experience because that's what people remember. People associate fun and lightheartedness with a good experience. And we have to marry the two. to a great extent for the overall experience to actually be repeatable and to bring people into museums.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I had a lot of fun in museums. And I think, you know, and me now, especially also thinking from the visual art side, if there are these artworks that also really touch you or hit you in one way or the other, this is like amazing and great if that happens. And often that is actually also through the more entertaining level. If we say entertaining can also be something that's probably maybe just beautiful or aesthetically very engaging, or, you know, and I think also it doesn't exclude itself, you know, there can be exhibitions and artworks that are aesthetically like very, you know, embracing and speak to you. And at the same time, they also talk about very complex topics or bring up things that the artists want to bring across. So I also think this idea of that it always has to be either discursive or entertaining doesn't have to be that way. I think there are really a lot of options to actually bring that together.
Thank you. So more of that tomorrow. You better stay tuned. Thank you for sharing your beautiful thoughts, and all the best, Yara, all the best, Yvette. And thank you for joining. Enjoy your evening. Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Bye.
Talking about museums and power. I'm here now in the museum with my friend Dicraeosaurus hansemani, who belongs to the family of the biggest creatures to ever walk on this planet. These creatures are also a constant topic in popular culture. And for tomorrow, we have another powerful day ahead of us. We will discuss about museums and entertainment. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for your engagement in the name of the organizing partners: Institut für Auslandsbeziehungen, Republika, Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin, and Germany's Federal Foreign Office. I see you tomorrow.